The morning rain pelted against the windows of the Cosmic Bean, a small coffee shop nestled in the multicultural district of New Geneva Station. Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter for the third time, watching droplets race down the glass as she waited for the morning rush that never seemed to come anymore. The shop had seen better days. Once a popular meeting spot for traders, diplomats, and travelers from across the galaxy, it now struggled to compete with the flashy corporate chains that had moved into the station's main sectors. Sarah's grandmother had opened this place 30 years ago, back when humans first joined the Galactic Council. Now, it felt like a relic, filled with mismatched furniture and the lingering aroma of a dozen different coffee varieties from as many worlds. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up from her cleaning. A figure stood in the doorway, dripping wet from the artificial rain that the station's weather system had been producing for the past week. The newcomer was tall, easily 7 feet, with scales that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue depending on the light. Wings were folded tight against their back, and a long tail swept nervously behind them. Sarah had seen plenty of dragons during her years working at the shop. They were one of the more common species in this part of the galaxy, though most kept to themselves. This one looked different, though their clothes were simple, almost worn, and they moved with a hesitancy that suggested they weren't used to being in public spaces like this. "Good morning," Sarah called out cheerfully, setting down her cleaning cloth. Come in, come in. Don't worry about the water." The dragon stepped inside, their large eyes scanning the nearly empty shop. Those eyes held an ancient quality that made Sarah pause. She'd seen old dragons before, ones who'd lived for centuries. But this one's gaze seemed to carry the weight of millennia. "I apologize for the intrusion," the dragon said, their voice deep and melodious with just a hint of uncertainty. "I was seeking shelter from the precipitation." Sarah noticed how they spoke with careful formality, as if they weren't used to casual conversation. "No intrusion at all. That's what coffee shops are for. Would you like something to warm you up?" The dragon hesitated, glancing around at the empty tables and chairs. "I do not wish to impose. I have no intention of purchasing anything." "Who said anything about purchasing?" Sarah moved around the counter, gesturing toward a comfortable armchair near the window. "Sit down. You look like you could use some company, and honestly, so could I. This place has been quieter than a morgue lately." The dragon's eyes widened slightly. "You would offer hospitality to a stranger? Without payment? Sure, why not?" Sarah was already moving toward the coffee machine. "What's your poison?" "I've got beans from Kepler, 442b, some Earth Ethiopian, or there's this new blend from the Andorian colonies that's supposed to be pretty good." For a long moment, the dragon simply stared at her. Sarah could almost see the gears turning in their head, as if they were trying to process this unexpected kindness. I am not familiar with human beverages," the dragon admitted finally, settling carefully into the offered chair. The furniture creaked slightly under their weight, but held. "Perhaps you could recommend something?" Sarah grinned. "I've been doing this for 15 years. She began preparing what her grandmother had called the friendship blend, a mixture of earth coffee and centauri root extract that was supposed to be palatable to most absent species. "So, what brings you to this part of the station?" "You don't strike me as the usual trader type." "I am between destinations," the dragon said carefully. "I find myself with time to observe your species' customs." "Observing humans, huh?" Sarah laughed as she worked. "Well, you picked an interesting spot for it. This district gets all kinds. Though honestly, most of the interesting people moved on when the big corporations started setting up shop in the central sectors." The dragon's tail curled around the base of the chair. "You speak as if this establishment has seen decline. That's putting it mildly." Sarah's tone remained cheerful despite the subject matter. "My grandmother opened this place back when the station was first built. She used to say that good coffee could bridge any cultural gap. Turns out she was half right. People love the coffee. They just prefer getting it from places with holographic advertisements and celebrity endorsements." Steam rose from the coffee machine as Sarah finished preparing the drink. She poured it into one of her favorite mugs, a simple ceramic piece painted with stars that her grandmother had made herself. "But hey," she continued, walking over with the coffee, "at least that means I get to meet interesting people like you. Most of the corporate places won't even let non-humanoids in without going through some ridiculous screening process." The dragon accepted the mug with both hands, holding it carefully as if it were made of the most delicate crystal. They inhaled the aroma, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something almost like surprise crossing their features. "This scent. It is quite pleasant," they said softly. "Wait until you taste it." Sarah pulled up another chair, sitting down across from her unexpected customer. "So what's your name?" "I'm Sarah, by the way." "Sarah Martinez." Again, that hesitation. The dragon stared into the coffee as if searching for answers in its dark surface. "You may call me Zephyr," they said finally. "Zephyr, I like it. Has a nice ring to it." Sarah settled back in her chair. "So, Zephyr, what do you think of human space so far? This your first time in our neck of the galaxy?" Zephyr took a careful sip of the coffee, and Sarah watched their eyes widen slightly. They seemed genuinely surprised by the taste. "This is remarkable," Zephyr said. "The flavors are complex, layered. I had not expected such sophistication from a simple beverage. Grandmother's secret recipe," Sarah said proudly. "She spent years perfecting it, trying to find something that would work for most species' palates. Dragons especially seem to like it. Something about the way the Centauri root extract interacts with your taste buds. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was, stubborn as a Terran mule, but wise." Sarah's expression grew fond. "She always said that the galaxy was getting too big, too impersonal. Places like this used to be where real connections were made, where deals were struck over shared meals and honest conversation." Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, sipping the coffee and staring out at the rain. "And you believe this as well?" "I do. I mean, look at us. An hour ago, we were complete strangers. Now we're sitting here like old friends, sharing coffee and conversation. When's the last time you could do that at one of those big corporate chains?" "Indeed." Zephyr's voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. "It has been quite some time since I have experienced such simple companionship." Sarah studied her new friend's expression. There was something deeply lonely about Zephyr. A kind of isolation that went beyond just being far from home. "You know what?" she said impulsively. "I usually open around 7 station time. I'll introduce you to some of the regulars. There aren't many, but they're good people." Zephyr looked up sharply. "You would welcome me back?" "Of course, why wouldn't I?" Zephyr seemed to struggle with the concept. "Many beings find my presence intimidating." Sarah laughed. "Intimidating? You're about as intimidating as a golden retriever. A really big golden retriever with scales and wings. But still." For the first time since entering the shop, Zephyr smiled. It transformed their entire face, making them seem younger somehow, less burdened. "Your species continues to surprise me," they said. "Good. Surprises keep life interesting." Sarah glanced at the chrono on the wall. "Speaking of which, I should probably start prepping for the lunch crowd." "What little there is of it." Zephyr immediately began to stand. "Of course, I have imposed upon your time far too long." "Whoa, hold on." Sarah gestured for them to sit back down. "Finish your coffee first. No rush, but surely you have work to do." "The work can wait. Besides, you haven't told me what you think of human space yet." "I'm genuinely curious about the dragon perspective." Zephyr settled back into the chair, cradling the mug in their hands. "Your species is unexpected." The reports I have read suggested that humans were primarily concerned with commerce and territorial expansion. "Reports? Sounds pretty official." A flicker of something crossed Zephyr's face. "Alarm, maybe?" "I simply meant the general information available through the galactic networks." Sarah nodded, though she filed away that momentary reaction. There was definitely more to Zephyr than met the eye. "Well, those reports probably aren't wrong about some humans," she said diplomatically. "But we're like any species. We've got all types. Some are out there trying to build empires, others just want to run coffee shops and make friends. And which type are you?" "Is that even a question?" Sarah gestured around the modest shop. "I'm definitely in the coffee shop and friends category. Always have been." They continued talking for another hour, with Zephyr asking seemingly innocent questions about human culture, and Sarah happily sharing stories about her grandmother, the shop, and life on the station. She found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Zephyr was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful follow-up questions and showing genuine interest in even mundane details. As the morning wore on, a few regular customers began to trickle in. Sarah introduced Zephyr to each of them. Marcus, a human freight hauler who always ordered black coffee. Trillia, a Centauri merchant who preferred tea. And old Korath, a gruff Klingon trader who had been coming to the shop for over a decade. What struck Sarah was how differently people reacted to Zephyr compared to how they usually treated new customers. Dragons weren't uncommon, but there was something about Zephyr's presence that seemed to put people at ease. Even Korath, who usually grumbled about newfangled aliens cluttering up the station, struck up a friendly conversation about trade routes. When Zephyr finally did leave, promising to return the next morning, Sarah found herself looking forward to it more than she had looked forward to anything in months. "Interesting fellow," Marcus commented, settling in at his usual table. "Something familiar about him, though. Can't put my finger on it." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, cleaning Zephyr's mug with more care than usual. "Probably nothing. Just the way he carried himself. Reminded me of some of the high-ranking council members I used to transport. Very regal, I guess." Sarah paused in her cleaning. Now that Marcus mentioned it, there had been something almost aristocratic about Zephyr's mannerisms. The careful way they spoke, the formal posture, even when relaxing, the surprise at simple kindness as if they weren't used to being treated like a regular person. But then again, lots of dragons had that kind of natural dignity. It was probably nothing. As the day wore on, Sarah found her thoughts returning to her new friend. There had been moments during their conversation when Zephyr seemed almost hungry for the simple human interaction, as if they had been starved for ordinary companionship. It made her wonder what kind of life they led. What kind of circumstances would leave someone so clearly intelligent and well-spoken, feeling so isolated? That evening, as she was closing up the shop, Sarah made a mental note to prepare some of grandmother's special pastries for the next morning. Something told her that Zephyr would appreciate the gesture, and besides, everyone deserved to experience the simple pleasure of good food shared with a friend. She had no way of knowing that her act of casual kindness had just begun to set in motion events that would reshape the political landscape of 3 sectors, and fundamentally alter humanity's standing in the Galactic Council. All she knew was that she had made a new friend, and that was worth celebrating. Outside, the artificial rain continued to fall, washing the station clean as Sarah locked up and headed home, already planning tomorrow's conversation topics. In her mind, Zephyr was simply a lonely traveler who appreciated good coffee and better company. The truth, as she would soon discover, was infinitely more complex and far more consequential than she could ever have imagined. Zephyr stood in the command center of the Eternal Majesty, staring out at the vast expanse of space through the panoramic viewport. The flagship of the Imperial fleet hung in orbit around New Geneva Station like a silent guardian, its massive bulk hidden from sensors by advanced cloaking technology that made it appear as nothing more than empty space. "Your Imperial Majesty," came a voice from behind him. Zephyr turned to see Admiral Thrace, his primary military advisor, approaching with the careful deference that all his subjects showed. The blue-skinned Andorian's antennae twitched with barely concealed anxiety. "Yes, Admiral? The Council of Ministers is growing concerned about your extended stay in this sector. Minister Vex has sent 17 messages requesting your immediate return to the capital." Zephyr's tail twitched with irritation. Minister Vex, his chief political advisor, had the diplomatic finesse of a charging rhino, and the understanding of subtle strategy of a particularly dim asteroid. Tell Minister Vex that the Emperor's schedule is not subject to his approval, Zephyr said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect for over 2 centuries. I will return when my business here is concluded. Of course, Your Majesty. But if I may ask, what exactly is our business here? We've been in orbit for 3 days, and our intelligence reports suggest nothing of strategic importance in this sector. Zephyr was quiet for a long moment. How could he explain that he had spent the last 3 mornings sitting in a small coffee shop, talking with a human woman who treated him like any other customer? How could he describe the simple pleasure of conversation without agenda, without courtly intrigue, without the constant weight of imperial responsibility? I am conducting cultural observation, he said finally. Understanding our subjects is crucial to effective governance. Admiral Thrace's antennae drooped slightly. Of course, Your Majesty. Very wise. It wasn't entirely a lie. In his 2 centuries of rule, Zephyr had governed the Galactic Empire from the isolation of the Imperial Palace, making decisions that affected billions of beings across thousands of worlds. He knew statistics, economic reports, and military assessments. He knew the names of every sector governor and the economic output of every major trade world. But until 3 days ago, he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be treated as a person. Prepare a shuttle, he said, glancing at the chrono. It was nearly 7 station time. I'll be returning to the station. Shall I alert our security detail? No. Zephyr had already started walking toward the shuttle bay. I can manage a simple shopping trip without an armed escort. Admiral Thrace's expression suggested he disagreed strongly with this assessment, but he knew better than to argue with his emperor. Yes, Your Majesty, I'll have the shuttle prepared immediately. 20 minutes later, Zephyr was walking through the corridors of New Geneva Station, once again dressed in the simple clothes he had purchased from a second-hand shop. He had left his imperial regalia, his ceremonial armor, and all the other trappings of power aboard his ship. Here, he was just Zephyr, a traveler with time to kill and a fondness for excellent coffee. The cosmic bean was just opening when he arrived. Through the window, he could see Sarah moving around behind the counter. Setting up for the day, she caught sight of him and waved, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing him again. Right on time, she called out as he entered. I was wondering if you'd actually show up. I said I would, Zephyr replied, settling into the same chair he had occupied the day before. True, but you wouldn't believe how many people promise to come back and then disappear forever. Coffee's on the house again, by the way. Zephyr felt that familiar flutter of surprise at her casual generosity. In his world, nothing was given freely. Every gift came with expectations. Every kindness had a price. That is very generous, but surely I should pay. Nope, Sarah was already preparing his coffee. New customer privileges. Besides, you're basically doing me a favor by keeping me company. This place gets pretty lonely sometimes. As she worked, Zephyr found himself studying her movements. There was an efficiency to her actions, born of years of practice, but also a genuine care in how she prepared each drink. She had told him yesterday that her grandmother's recipe was designed to work for different species. And watching her now, he could see the subtle adjustments she made. A slightly different temperature, a particular ratio of ingredients. So, Sarah said, bringing over the coffee along with a plate of small pastries. Tell me about where you're from. Yesterday I did most of the talking. Zephyr accepted the pastries with curiosity. They smelled wonderful, with hints of spices he recognized from various worlds across the empire. These are beautiful, he said, genuinely impressed. Grandmother's recipe again. She called them peace cakes, because she designed them to be appealing to as many different palates as possible. Go on, try one. Zephyr bit into one of the small cakes and had to close his eyes for a moment. The flavor was extraordinary, complex layers that shifted as he chewed, revealing notes that seemed specifically designed to appeal to draconic taste receptors. How did she know to balance the flavors in such a way? Sarah's expression grew fond. 50 years of experimentation, and a lot of very patient customers. She used to say that food was the universal language, but you had to learn the local dialects. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She really was. But you're changing the subject. Where are you from originally? Channel. Zephyr hesitated. The truth was that he had been hatched on the imperial homeworld of Dracoris Prime, in the royal hatchery deep beneath the Palace of Eternal Flames. He had never known any home other than the seat of galactic power. The Draconis system, he said carefully. It was technically true. Oh, that's one of the core systems, right? I've never been there, but I've heard it's beautiful. It has its charms, Zephyr said diplomatically. Dracoris Prime was indeed beautiful, in a remote and formal way. Vast crystal spires reaching toward perfect skies, gardens maintained with mathematical precision, architecture that spoke of power and permanence. But it had been centuries since he had thought of it as beautiful, rather than simply impressive. What brought you out this way? It's a pretty far trip from the core systems to the rim territories. Another question that required careful navigation. The truth was that he had come here because his intelligence network had reported some unusual human activity in this sector. Rumors of a new trade alliance that might affect imperial interests. But after 3 days of investigation, it had turned out to be nothing more than a small collective of coffee shop owners trying to source better beans. I am between obligations, he said, which was closer to the truth than she might realize. I find travel broadens one's perspective. That's a very diplomatic answer, Sarah said with a laugh. You sure you're not a politician? Zephyr nearly choked on his coffee. What makes you say that? Just the way you talk. Very careful, like you're used to having your words analyzed. Most traders are pretty blunt. They tell you exactly what they think, whether you want to hear it or not. Perhaps I am simply naturally cautious. Maybe. Or maybe you're used to having your words matter more than most people's. There was something in her tone that made Zephyr look at her more carefully. Sarah was still smiling, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she was more perceptive than she generally let on. You are very observant, he said. Comes with the territory. When you run a place like this, you learn to read people pretty quickly. You get all types through here. Traders trying to pass off fake goods, diplomats on secret missions, refugees running from problems in other sectors. After a while, you develop a sense for when someone isn't telling you the whole story. And you believe I am not telling you the whole story? Sarah shrugged, refilling his coffee cup. Everyone's got secrets. The question is whether they're the kind of secrets that matter to friendship. It was such a simple statement, but it hit Zephyr like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had offered him friendship without knowing who he was? When was the last time someone had judged him based on his character rather than his power? You are very trusting, he said quietly, or very stupid, depending on who you ask. Sarah settled back in her chair. But I figure life's too short to spend it suspicious of everyone you meet. Besides, you bought coffee for me yesterday. You bought coffee for me. Same thing. The point is, we've shared a meal. That makes us friends in my book. At least until you give me a reason to think otherwise. Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. In his world, friendship was a political tool. Alliance was a strategic necessity. And trust was a liability that could get you killed. The idea that someone would offer genuine companionship based on nothing more than a shared beverage was almost incomprehensible. And yet, here he sat, more relaxed and content than he had been in decades. Your species, he said slowly, approaches relationships very differently than mine. How so? Dragons are cautious by nature. We form alliances based on mutual benefit, and we maintain careful hierarchies. Casual friendship, as you describe it, is not common. Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. That sounds pretty lonely. It is the way of things. Maybe for dragons in general, but it doesn't have to be the way for you specifically. Again, that simple directness that cuts straight through layers of complexity and tradition. Zephyr found himself wondering what Sarah would make of Imperial Court. With its elaborate protocols and careful rituals, she would probably horrify the courtiers and charm half the ministers. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, the freight hauler Zephyr had met the day before. The human nodded politely to both of them as he made his way to the counter. Morning, Sarah, The usual, please. Coming right up. Marcus, you remember Zephyr from yesterday? Of course. Good to see you again. Marcus glanced at Zephyr with that same expression of vague recognition. You know, I've been trying to place where I might have seen you before. You ever do any work in the Centauri sector? Zephyr's pulse quickened slightly. The Centauri sector housed several important Imperial installations, and he had made numerous official visits there over the years. I have spent some time in that region, he said carefully. Probably just one of those faces, Marcus said with a shrug. You know how it is. Travel enough, and everyone starts looking familiar. Sarah handed Marcus his coffee, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But Zephyr noticed that Marcus continued to glance at him occasionally, as if trying to solve a puzzle. After Marcus left, Sarah seemed to pick up on Zephyr's slight discomfort. Don't mind him, she said. Marcus is convinced he's met everyone in the galaxy at least twice. Last month he was sure our Vulcan customer was his sister's neighbor's cousin or something. I am not concerned, Zephyr said, though he made a mental note to be more careful about his public appearances. The last thing he needed was for someone to make the connection between the dragon sitting in a coffee shop and the emperor of the known galaxy. They spent the rest of the morning in comfortable conversation, with Sarah sharing more stories about her customers and her grandmother, and Zephyr finding himself talking more freely than he had in years. He told her about his travels, carefully edited to remove any reference to Imperial business, and found genuine pleasure in her reactions to his descriptions of different worlds and cultures. As the lunch crowd began to arrive, Zephyr prepared to leave. Same time tomorrow? Sarah asked, as she had the day before. If you do not mind the company, mind it. You're the best part of my morning. Besides, I still haven't heard about what you actually do for work. All this traveling has to pay for itself somehow. Zephyr paused in the doorway. Perhaps tomorrow, he said, knowing full well that he could never tell her the truth. As he walked back through the station corridors, Zephyr found himself thinking about Sarah's casual offer of friendship. In 3 days, she had shown him more genuine warmth and acceptance than he had experienced in the past 3 decades. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and offered everything with a generosity that both amazed and humbled him. Back aboard his ship, Admiral Thrace was waiting with another stack of urgent communications from the capital. Your Majesty, Minister Vex is threatening to bring the matter before the full council. He says that the Emperor cannot simply disappear without explanation. Zephyr took the messages without reading them. Tell Minister Vex that the Emperor is exactly where he needs to be. Sir, with respect, the Council has legitimate concerns. Your schedule shows several important meetings that you've missed, and there are trade agreements waiting for your approval. The trade agreements can wait another day or two. The meetings can be rescheduled. Zephyr moved toward his private chambers. The galaxy managed to function for billions of years before I was hatched, Admiral. I think it can manage a few more days. Admiral Thrace's antennae drooped with resigned acceptance. Yes, Your Majesty. That evening, as Zephyr stood once again at his viewport looking down at the station, he found himself thinking about Sarah's words. Life's too short to spend it suspicious of everyone you meet. For someone who commanded the fates of trillions, it was a dangerously naive philosophy. And yet, for the first time in centuries, he was looking forward to tomorrow not because of what he might accomplish or what problems he might solve, but simply because he would have the chance to sit in a small coffee shop and talk with a friend. The fact that she had no idea who he really was only made the friendship more precious. In all his years of rule, Zephyr had never experienced the simple pleasure of being liked for himself rather than feared for his power. He was beginning to understand why his intelligence reports had so consistently underestimated human cultural influence. There was something quietly revolutionary about their approach to relationships, something that could change the way entire civilizations thought about community and connection. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask Sarah more about her philosophy of friendship. Not as an emperor seeking to understand his subjects, but as someone who had forgotten what it meant to simply be a person. The irony was not lost on him that in trying to understand humanity for political purposes, he was rediscovering his own capacity for simple happiness. It was exactly the kind of unintended consequence that would have amused his grandmother if the old empress were still alive to see it. Sarah was running late on the 7th morning of what she had come to think of as Zephyr Week. A malfunction in her apartment's water recycling system had delayed her morning routine, and she arrived at the Cosmic Bean 15 minutes after her usual opening time to find Zephyr waiting patiently outside, looking as composed as ever. "I'm so sorry," she called out, fumbling with her keys. "Technical difficulties at home. You must think I'm completely unreliable." "Not at all," Zephyr replied, though Sarah noticed he seemed more tense than usual. "I have only just arrived myself." As she opened the shop and began her morning preparations, Sarah chatted about the water recycling problem, while Zephyr settled into what had become his usual chair. Over the past week, their morning routine had become as natural as breathing. Coffee for both of them, pastries if she had them, and conversation that ranged from philosophy to station gossip, to stories about their respective backgrounds. Well, her background anyway. Zephyr remained mysteriously vague about his own life, though he was an excellent listener and always seemed genuinely interested in her tales of growing up on a trading station and learning the coffee business from her grandmother. "Your usual?" she asked, though she was already preparing his drink exactly the way he preferred it. "Please." Zephyr's voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. "Sarah, I must tell you something." She glanced over at him while measuring out the Centauri root extract. "That sounds ominous. Please tell me you're not about to confess to being a serial killer or something." "Nothing so dramatic." But Zephyr's expression remained serious. "I will likely need to leave the station soon. My obligations require my attention elsewhere." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Over the past week, she had genuinely begun to look forward to Zephyr's visits. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed a quiet sense of humor that complemented her own more energetic personality perfectly. "That's too bad," she said, bringing over his coffee. "I've gotten used to having you around. It's been nice having someone to talk to who actually listens. These past few days have been..." Zephyr paused, seeming to search for words. "They have been among the most pleasant of my life." There was something in his tone that made Sarah study his face more carefully. She had suspected for days that there was more to Zephyr than he was letting on. But now she was certain of it. The formal way he spoke, the careful attention he paid to everything around him, the quality of his clothes that looked simple but were clearly made from expensive materials. It all added up to someone who was used to a very different kind of life than he was pretending to live. "Zephyr," she said gently, settling into her chair across from him. "Who are you really?" His hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. "I am not sure I understand." "Come on. I've been running this place for 15 years, and I've met every type of person you can imagine. You're not just some random traveler. The way you talk, the way you move, even the way you listen. It's like you're used to having people hang on your every word." Quote. Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his coffee. When he looked up, Sarah saw something almost like fear in his ancient eyes. "Would it matter?" he asked quietly. "If I were not who you think I am?" "That depends on what you mean. Are you running from the law? Are you married? Are you going to disappear and leave me wondering for the rest of my life whether our friendship meant anything to you?" "No," Zephyr said quickly. "No, none of those things. It is simply that my actual circumstances are complicated. And I have valued our time together precisely because you know me as simply Zephyr. Rather than..." He trailed off. "Rather than what?" Before Zephyr could answer, the coffee shop's front door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Sarah looked up to see a group of beings in elaborate military uniforms rushing in, followed by several more in formal robes. The one in front, a blue-skinned Andorian with intricate gold braiding on his uniform, spotted Zephyr and immediately dropped to one knee. "Your Imperial Majesty," the Andorian said in a voice that carried clearly through the small shop. "We have been searching for you. Minister Vex has declared a state of emergency. He claims you have been kidnapped or assassinated." Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers and shattered against the floor. The Andorian continued speaking, apparently oblivious to Sarah's shock. The entire sector fleet is mobilizing for a rescue operation. Admiral Corvin has already begun interrogating suspicious individuals on the lower levels. We must return you to the flagship immediately. Admiral Thrace, Zephyr said quietly. And Sarah heard the unmistakable voice of absolute authority. Stand down. There has been no kidnapping. But Your Majesty, Minister Vex insists. Minister Vex, Zephyr said, rising to his full height, does not give orders to the Emperor. Emperor. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at Zephyr, at the Emperor of the Galactic Empire, as the full magnitude of the situation crashed down on her. For a week, she had been buying coffee for the most powerful being in known space. She had been treating him like a lonely traveler, offering him pastries and casual conversation and friendship. The Emperor, the dragon who ruled 3/4 of the galaxy, whose word was law across thousands of systems, whose decisions affected the lives of trillions of beings, and she had been calling him Zephyr and asking about his travel plans. Sarah, Zephyr said, and his voice was gentle, almost pleading. Please allow me to explain. But Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't think. The beings in military uniforms were arranging themselves around the coffee shop like a protective detail, and one of the robed figures was scanning the area with some kind of security device. All clear, Your Majesty, the scanner-wielding figure reported. No surveillance devices. No hidden threats. Of course there aren't, Zephyr said with a touch of impatience. This is a coffee shop, not a war zone. Admiral Thrace looked uncomfortable. Your Majesty, with respect, disappearing without your security detail for a week is exactly what I needed. Zephyr's gaze never left Sarah's face. Admiral, escort your people outside. I will join you shortly. Your Majesty, protocol requires, Admiral. The single word carried such quiet force that even Sarah felt the urge to obey. Outside. Now, the military personnel filed out with obvious reluctance, leaving Sarah and Zephyr alone in the coffee shop. The silence stretched between them until Sarah finally found her voice. Emperor, she said, and the word felt strange in her mouth. Please, Zephyr said quickly. Please do not call me that. Not here, but that's what you are. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You're the Emperor of the galaxy. And we have been friends, Zephyr said firmly. That has not changed, hasn't it? Sarah looked around her modest shop, seeing it suddenly through the eyes of galactic royalty. The mismatched furniture, the worn floors, the simple decorations that her grandmother had chosen decades ago. It all seemed impossibly humble and small. Sarah, please listen to me. Zephyr took a step toward her, then stopped when she flinched back. I came here on routine business. Imperial intelligence had reports of unusual activity in this sector. I was supposed to investigate, file a report, and leave. But I discovered that the unusual activity was a group of coffee shop owners trying to coordinate bean purchases. A small smile crossed his face. Hardly a threat to Imperial security. I should have left immediately. Why didn't you? Zephyr was quiet for a moment. Because it had been raining, and I was tired, and your shop looked warm and welcoming. Because you offered me coffee and conversation, with no expectation of anything in return. Because for the first time in over 2 centuries, someone looked at me and saw a person rather than a position. Sarah stared at him. 2 centuries? I have been emperor for 237 years, Zephyr said quietly. In all that time, every interaction, every conversation, every relationship has been shaped by what I represent, rather than who I am. Do you have any idea what that is like? No, Sarah admitted. I can't imagine. It is a very lonely existence. Everyone who speaks to me wants something. Approval, resources, protection, favor. Everyone who serves me does so out of duty or fear or ambition. I am surrounded by thousands of beings every day, and I have not had a friend in longer than you have been alive. The simple honesty in his voice cut through Sarah's shock. She found herself looking past the impossible reality of his identity and seeing the loneliness that had been there all along, hidden behind careful formality and ancient eyes. So you lied to me. I omitted certain facts about my circumstances, Zephyr corrected gently. Everything else was true. My enjoyment of our conversations, my appreciation for your kindness, He paused. My gratitude for your friendship. All of that was real. But what happens now? Sarah gestured toward the windows, where she could see the Imperial guards waiting outside. You go back to being Emperor. And I go back to serving coffee. And we pretend this week never happened? That, Zephyr said, depends on you. On me? Sarah Martinez, Zephyr said formally. And suddenly his voice carried all the weight and authority of his position. You have shown kindness to the Emperor of the Galaxy without expectation of reward. By ancient law and tradition, that makes you eligible for Imperial recognition. I can offer you titles, wealth, a position in the Imperial Court. Name your desire, and it shall be yours. Sarah blinked. You're offering me... What? To become space nobility? If you wish it. And if I don't wish it, then you continue as you are, with the Emperor's gratitude and protection, but otherwise unchanged. Sarah looked around her shop again, thinking about her grandmother's dreams and her own simple life. Then she looked back at Zephyr, at the Emperor, and saw that he was watching her with something that might have been hope. Can I ask you something? Of course. This past week, sitting here, drinking coffee and talking, were you happy? Zephyr's expression softened. Happier than I have been in decades. Then I have a counterproposal. I am listening. Sarah took a deep breath. You said you don't have friends. What if you did? What if you had a place you could come, maybe once a month or so, where you could just be Zephyr the Traveler instead of the Emperor, where someone would make you coffee and ask about your day and treat you like a person? You would. Especially knowing who you are. Sarah's voice grew stronger. Everyone deserves to have a friend, even emperors. Maybe especially emperors. Zephyr stared at her for a long moment. You would ask for nothing else? No titles? No wealth? No advancement? I don't want to be space nobility. I want to run my grandmother's coffee shop and make friends with interesting people who come through. It just so happens that one of those interesting people rules the galaxy. Sarah, Zephyr said quietly, do you understand what you are offering? Friendship to someone in my position comes with dangers. There will be beings who would harm you to get to me. Then I guess you'll have to make sure they don't, Sarah said with a smile. You are the Emperor, after all. For the first time since his guards had burst through the door, Zephyr smiled. It was the same warm expression she had seen every morning for a week. But now she understood the profound significance of it. In all the galaxy, she might be the only being who could make the Emperor smile, simply by offering friendship. Very well, Zephyr said. I accept your counterproposal. But I have conditions of my own. Such as? First, you will accept Imperial protection. Discreet, unobtrusive, but present. Second, if you ever need anything at all, you will contact me immediately. And third, he paused. Third, you will allow me to pay for my coffee. I refuse to accept charity from friends. Sarah laughed, the sound breaking the last of the tension between them. Deal. But I'm keeping the pastries free. House rules. Sarah. Zephyr moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Sarah, thank you. For the coffee, for the conversation, and for showing me that it is possible to be both an emperor and a person. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. Try not to let that Minister Vex guy give you too much trouble. Minister Vex, Zephyr said with a slight smile, is about to learn the difference between questioning imperial policy and questioning imperial judgment. It will be an educational experience for him. As Zephyr left the shop, resuming the bearing and presence of absolute authority as he rejoined his guards, Sarah began cleaning up the broken coffee cup. Through the window, she watched the most powerful being in the galaxy disappear into a crowd of worried advisors and protective personnel. But she knew he would be back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week. But eventually, Zephyr the Traveler would return to the cosmic bean, looking for good coffee and better friendship. and Sarah would be waiting, ready to offer both without question or condition. Because that's what friends did for each other, even when one of those friends happened to rule the known universe. As she finished cleaning up and began preparing for the rest of her day, Sarah found herself smiling. Her grandmother had always said that good coffee could bridge any cultural gap. She probably hadn't imagined that gap might include the distance between a small-town coffee shop owner and the emperor of the galaxy. But the principle still held. Some things, Sarah reflected, were truly universal. Friendship, kindness, and the simple pleasure of sharing a good cup of coffee with someone who appreciated both the beverage and the company. The galaxy, she decided, was a smaller and friendlier place than most people realized. Outside, Admiral Thrace was delivering what was clearly a lecture about Imperial security protocols. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could see Zephyr's patient expression as he listened to concerns about proper procedure and risk assessment. When the Admiral finished, Zephyr said something that made the blue-skinned officer's antennae droop in resignation. Then the Emperor of the Galaxy looked back at the coffee shop, raised one hand in a small wave, and disappeared into an official transport that had definitely not been there moments before. Sarah waved back, already looking forward to their next conversation. She had a feeling that being friends with the Emperor was going to make her life significantly more interesting, and she wouldn't have it any other way.